Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pari Center and our Book a Month Club, an informal monthly get-together to discuss books of significance for the Pari Center community. This month, we're featuring The Anomaly by Hervé Le Tellier, hosted by Beverley Zabriskie. The Anomaly is the winner of the 2020 Goncourt Prize and now an international phenomenon. It is a novel blends crime, fantasy, sci-fi, and thriller as it plumbs the mysteries surrounding a Paris-New York flight. Who would we be if we had made different choices? Told that secret, left that relationship, or written that book? We all wonder, and the passengers of Air France 006 will find out. About to start their descent to JFK, they hit a shockingly violent patch of turbulence, emerging on the other side, to reality both perfectly familiar and utterly strange. As it charts the fallout of this logic-defying event, The Anomaly takes us on a journey from Lagos and Mumbai to the White House and a top-secret hangar. Beverley Zabriskie is a Jungian analyst in New York City, a founding faculty member and former president of the Jungian Psychoanalytical Association, where she teaches Jungian therapy and practice, theories of emotion, psychological interpretation of Egyptian mythology, and alchemical imagery. She is a past vice president of the Philemon Foundation, which produced the Red Book, and other unpublished volumes by C.G. Jung. She is an associate editor of the Journal of Analytic Psychology and on the Helix Center for Interdisciplinary Investigation Executive Committee. I will now hand over the discussion to Beverley.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. And Eleanor, thank you for the Pari Center's invitation to do this program.
Thank you for being here.
I've been to Pari once a couple of years ago, and it was really, as any of you who've been there know, a real high point of my life and history and work. You may see the background here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it doesn't exactly look like the city of New York. I guess you can't see it because my screen moves with me. But I'm in the Hudson Valley because I like being here and for a very specific reason in terms of this book, which I will tell you about in a minute. I had originally thought of doing this meeting on von Franz's creation myths. And then when I got the announcement that the anomalous was the theme of the year, this seemed so obvious that this would be a good choice. And it's wonderful in this area, especially. This is the world of Washington Irving and the Headless Horseman and Rip Van Winkle. It's got all sorts of those mythical literary traditions here. It also has a major historical tradition insofar as it's the town nearest here. Rhinebeck is the place where Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to the duel that killed him. So it's one of these places, and if you saw Hamilton, it kept referring to the Schuyler sisters, who were one of whom was his wife, and they lived right around the corner practically from me. Chris Hauk knows this area, and through Chris, can I say what you're working on? Maybe I can't anyway, but Chris has been here sort of researching the Hudson Valley painters.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
So very soon, Chris, do you want to tell them just a little bit about that project?
No, it's just about the early watercolor painters from Britain, and one of them goes across, two of them go across and meet the Hudson Valley painters. But you know, I've discovered it involves a lot to do with class and to do with civilized and uncivilized. The gypsies and the civilized people, the Indians and the so-called civilized people, and the art brings them together. That's roughly how it goes at the moment.
So that's where I am. And I don't know if you can see this far background, but behind me is what we call a mountain. It's really kind of a high hill. whose original Indian name was She Who Sleeps. So we have Rip Van Winkle on one side and She Who Sleeps on the other. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of, you know, this landscape. So I chose this book. I don't know how many of you really have had a chance to read it. And as I mentioned, through Sonu Shamdasani, I came to know about this Aleppo school, which I don't think is really a topic for today, but I wanted you just to know about it, to know what were the confines within which this man was writing a book. He's written many. They were all, you know, popular literature in France. This was his first big bestseller, international bestseller. And I think there's now a TV series in the making called The Anomaly. So I'm wondering if you would like to choose a pair that you were particularly drawn to, or just have first a bit of a general remarks about this book and different ways to think about it and approach it. Maybe I'll do that first, but then let's think about talking about the pairs that you thought were particularly interesting. Now so is that feel right to you? Is that all right? And
Yes,
is
I
there,
think I think that's a
and
great way.
I'm expecting that there's a lot of discussion. Is that how you've really been?
Yes, of course. We'll open it up to the group and let's get a discussion going with everybody. Absolutely. So whenever you feel that that's the right moment to do that, Beverly, we can do that.
All right. And I thought we could go for an hour, take a 5-minute break, and then come back and really also have whatever the last questions are. So we'll proceed that way. So one can read this book in so many ways. It can be a detective story. It could be investigative. It could be a study of human nature. It could be a fictional sense of what's being handled in the sciences these days. The particular draw for me as a Jungian analyst is that it picks up a theme that is central and crucial to Jung, insofar as he called the psyche a multiplicity within a unity, and that the whole task of the analytic endeavor is to try to get those different multiplicities within ourselves in some kind of conversation with each other. So in other words, it isn't just ego and unconscious. It's also all those parts that are more conscious or more unconscious into dialogue. And his approach to that was each of these figures represented a part of ourselves, what he calls splinter psyches or complexes. And our complexes appear in our behaviors, our reactions, and also in our dreams. Dreams, for Jung, were images of our complex stories and reactions. Insofar as complexes have a very emotional core, and our dreams are our psyche's attempt from his view of dealing with the emotions that our own unconscious want us to face, that have been unresolved. So we could certainly see this novel as a list, as a spectrum, as a cast of characters, that in each pairing we could see either is one complex talking to the other, or we could see as the dialogue between conscious and unconscious that Jung called individuation, which from his perspective made it more possible to relate to the outer world because there was a firmness within. So we can look at each of these characters as being more or less conscious, more or less aware of the multiplicity within them. and more or less able to be in dialogue. And I had suggested when I sent a note that you might choose a pair or more than one pair, and even to yourself, sort of given your prognosis of whether the first self or the second self and the second self were going to make it and get along. And so you can really see it as a kind of list of, in quote, psychological types, the Jungian idea of different typologies and of different personalities, some of them healthy and sane, and some of them sort of disordered. And in one sense, one of them really a sociopath, if not a psychopath. So all of this is, what do we integrate? What don't we integrate? What do we manage to bring into our own ken and not only talk to within ourselves, but get our different parts talking? So we could look at it that way, psychologically. We could also look at it as a fictional version of some of the issues, challenges, problems in modern physics and modern sciences. And the one that most occurs to me is a line from Carlo Rovelli, the physicist and author's book Helgoland. And in it, he talks about, it's not only that we have to realize that, you know, this old, not argument exactly, but dialogue in physics about, are the particle and the wave there until they're observed? And Rovelli says that in modern physics and the human relationship to it, it's also time and space itself. That he says, if we follow through, especially on quantum physics, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with from the incredible programs at the Pari Center, does time and space exist at all if there weren't observers of it? So that's quite a challenge. He repeats, we all know this part, that time and space are not part of the universal laws. They came after the Big Bang. And did they come after when there were creatures to observe it or not, and to participate with it? So it's that huge kind of existential / science question that perhaps this novel also takes up. Who knows what was first? Who knows what was second? Is there a first and second? Is time just the human attempt to explain change over a duration? So is it even science fiction in that regard? Is it something that could happen especially if it's all taken symbolically? So those are two of the issues. Another one is the whole question of who we are once we enter into the internet virtual reality space. And are we different? Are we less ourselves? Are we more ourselves within that virtual reality space, which is now, especially for young people, where they have an experience of themselves? And the major philosopher of mind who writes about this is David Chalmers. He's an NYU philosopher. And last year he wrote the book Reality Plus. And one of his tenets is that we're more real in a virtual world. Now, I have to admit, I'm only partway through that book, because my fantasy about that book is that AI wrote it, because there's so much repetition in it. So I think he just put this out, and one day he's going to reveal to us as a big surprise that AI wrote that book. So that's my own little version of, how to approach that book. But if anyone is interested in it, that's a very good model. And Harold Ottensbacher, of course, is part of the whole science of consciousness conference network, where he presents and Chalmers presents. Now, Harold presents on what he calls dual aspect monism, which is his updating of Jung's idea of synchronicity. And as you know, that's based on the idea that there is a mind-matter link. And so in that fantasy, you could say that everyone who got on that first plane, if it was the first, and we don't know, really didn't want to land in New York, right? And it somehow magically conjured up the storm that made it impossible for the plane to land and for them to go off somewhere, who knows where, to have a whole alternate life experience. So these are just some of the issues that come up in this novel, whether it's a science fiction one or a study of man and the complexity of human beings or theories of time and space. So I wonder which of these you might want to pursue here. Do you want to choose a pair to discuss? Does each person care to choose a pair? And what could we make of it in terms of Jung's whole idea of part selves? Or, and this just makes it all more complicated, to go into it from Max Tegmark, the physicist Max Tegmark, and his theory of the metaverse, where we all have, in the theory of the metaverse, there's other universes that match our own, and that there's another Beverley Zabriskie somewhere else in one of the metaverses who's also giving a lecture, and there's doubles of you, or maybe triples, depending on, how many metaverses there are, who are also listening to this. So if you don't hear it through one set of ears, you might hear it through another set of ears. So that's just another thing to sort of play with. We're all meant to play with this. Just a little footnote, how many, you don't have to say it out loud, how many named planets do you think that there are in our galaxy? Now named planets. It's not just the ones in our astrology systems. Well, the last time I went to a cosmology conference, it was 550. And about 500 more are named each year, where they're visible, they're oriented, they're located, and they're named. So it could be there are 550 other versions of us somewhere in the universe. So every morning you can wake up and think about which version of yourself you woke up with that day, and if you're going to stay in touch with it, or you're going to let it just go off on its own. We know where that can go. So could I have a little sense of it from you of what you want to give priority to in terms of these possibilities? Do we create time and space? Are we part of a metaverse where mirror images of ourselves exist? Would we want to meet those others? How much do we want to meet these internal psychological parts of ourselves? Will we get along with them? Will there be consilience?
We actually have Veronica, who has her hand raised, possibly for your question. Veronica, would you like to jump in? And
yeah, Michael, please handle that for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead,
Thank you,
Veronica.
Michael. Thank you,
You're
everybody.
welcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't mean to be selfish by presenting, but I'm interested and you started to mention it. I was going to mention synchronicity in Jung and the simulation theory. I have been followed for about 2 or 3 years now. Don Hoffman, Carlo Rovelli, Nick Bostrom, Max Tegmark, Lee Smolin, a few others, and of course, David Chalmers. And so I was thinking about it. You started to actually talk about synchronicity, but I find the simulation theory, especially according to Nick Bostrom, is very, very intriguing at all levels. I mean, not just mentally, intellectually, which, you know, is so difficult to understand, but emotionally, it does something to you to just think about it. So, and I work at the Jung Institute in Washington, D.C., and we never talk about these topics. So that's what I was thinking about.
Could you say how you understand the simulation theory?
I cannot say how I understand it. I could say that I feel it in my in my flesh. But what interests me is that, because I'm also in religious studies, I was teaching religious studies, is for those who are really believers, you know, to come up with the idea that maybe God's creation could be perceived as a simulation. I mean, if I had to teach now, you know, to students who are very religious, it wouldn't be very easy to present that concept to them. Other than that, you know, I started by rejecting the theory totally. I said, no, this is just not nonsense, but I mean, it's just, you know, a lot of intellectual thinking from very gifted people. But after a couple of years, now I'm changing. And I wonder what Jung would have thought about it.
Well, I don't know if you think of this as relevant, but Jung kept insisting that we basically know what we experience. And therefore, he talked about the God image in the psyche. I don't know if I'm going off track from what you're saying, but let me just say this, and then we can get me back on track. And that there what he knew for sure from experience, his own, and working with patients over 50 years, that there existed a form of a God image in the psyche, and that he knew. So when he was asked in that BBC lecture, do you believe in God? He said, as a psychologist, not a theologian, because he kept insisting he couldn't talk about it in a transcendent way. He was a psychologist, not a theologian. He said, I don't believe I know. And what he knew is that there exists a God image in the psyche, and that can get projected onto anything. It could be projected onto the idea of a creator God. It could be projected onto a God that was all-knowing, unchanging, everlasting. Those are the 3 qualities mostly projected in Western religions on God, which I've always found a little bit depressing, to have the idea that God is unchanging. I mean, you wouldn't want parents who are unchanging either. But Jung's approach to that was quite the opposite of Freud's, which I find quite compelling. In Psychology of the Transference, Jung talks about how we really have to deal with the parental images from our personal unconscious before we can have a true access to the idea of anything transcendent, not just out of the ego, but outside the psyche. because otherwise we keep projecting parental images, parental needs, anthropomorphizing divine figures, right? And I think that's relevant here, that the idea that everything we take in comes through projective fields, and that the less we've dealt with parental energies, the more we're going to transfer those, not just into our therapies, but into all the people around us and the world and how we understand things. I just want to mention one concept that has recently emerged from emotion studies, which you mentioned, emotion, and that is in the emotion researcher Joseph Ledoux's book, The 400 Billion-Year-Old Brain. It's an extraordinary book. It's only about 700 pages. It's not exactly weekend reading, but it's beautifully written. And he talks about how we have every level of knowing in us from which we emerge, starting with the unicellular. So we have unicellular knowing, we have sponge knowing, we have animal knowing, and that makes up our whole personality. And after years and years of writing about emotion theory, and especially fear, and talking about how fear and awe, but fear, which is a certain form of awe, was what caused us to act and react, that we were reacting to some outside factor. In today's language, a term that bothers me a lot is trigger. And after years of this work out of his lab at NYU, he apologizes in this book about how wrong he was. And says that he now understands we don't respond to the outside factor that we fear. We respond through our expectation of whether it will be fearful or not. Now, this may not be exactly what you're talking about in terms of simulation, that what we create, but I hope it's relevant somehow to the whole idea that we have a certain expectation of what a God figure would simulate. Is that relevant to you?
Yes, it certainly is. Thank you so much. And so what I think is important in the particular scientific, shall we say, simulation theory aspects is that in a way it pushes us to de-anthropomorphize. So to come out of ourselves, so to speak, hopefully get a sense of a different reality. And then we can sort of compare and see when we come up with all the images you described and all the emotions, particularly the fear. So I think this is why I found this work around the simulation important and actually not at all nonsense, except when you hear that there's a mad teenager, creating the simulations. That's just a story. But I like the fact that it creates the possibility to de-anthropomorphize and to see what are the constructs that we are falling into.
Okay, great. That's I'm sure this will follow through our
Great.
discussion. And I just want to add one more thing here, is that we could see this whole novel as the author's, in a Jungian term, active imagination, that he's in dialogue with all the different parts of himself, all the different opposites within, and is attempting somehow to gather them together in terms of what his self experience is, not only the experience of those he's met in his lifetime or read about in his lifetime. I think that's also, from a psychology point of view, a very interesting way to go. It's Jung's idea that we get into active imagination with the parts of ourselves that are more subliminal and have an ongoing dialogue. So other thoughts, other reflections, other
Yes.
demands?
We have another gentleman with his hand raised. Michael, if you
Okay.
could jump in as well.
Can you be sure we can see you when?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to respond, particularly since we're talking about Jung, we might talk about dreams, and particularly the dream is an organic simulation of
Mhm.
something, of
Mhm.
reality, and we inhabit that. And I think of Jung's pointing to the Eastern metaphor or question: are we dreaming of a butterfly, or are we a butterfly dreaming? Which brings us to the question whether there's such a thing as a waking dream in which we inhabit, and holding the possibility that we can wake up from it, which really takes us to Kant on one side and very much to the Buddha on the other. And it's interesting that one of my friends who's a Buddhist teacher takes his students first thing, to see The Matrix, the movie.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And here you get an image of the whole thing. My own feeling is that simulation theory is extremely primitive, that it's a contemporary cybernated version of primitive animism, where we begin to think, and people do react to computers and all associated with them, as in somehow alive, as somehow this other than machines, and so on and so forth. And this is a kind of primitive, the recurrence of a primitive animism, I think, where we project and endow our cybernated understanding of reality with an independent reality of its own, which it does not have. These are machines, just like I increase the power of my arm by using a backhoe or a shovel. These leverage things like memory, like our capacity for computation, and so on and so forth. They're just doing that. They're nothing beyond that.
Well,
But
that's an
a
interesting
lot
way.
into them.
Yeah. That's also an interesting way to look at these characters in this book, because you could, I was actually thinking when I first read it, these are stories about what people give mana to. And there's that whole theory of mana that does come out of primal tribes and primal societies. So that, for instance, can you hear me okay without an echo? Okay.
Yeah.
For instance, if the sacred tree of a tribe is cut down by the opposing tribe, the tribe could totally lose its spirit and actually die out.
Yes.
But what more modern theorists have pointed out is that mana is not in the object, it's in what people bring to the object.
Right.
So that if that tree goes, it's perfectly possible for the tribe to project mana onto another tribe. Another tree. It's not in the object.
But the whole thing is these processes are unconscious, and therefore we aren't consciously projecting anything. We're just directly experiencing them in that way. And I'm suggesting the same thing is also true in the simulation theory, that they're mana in that sense, and it's not. And we don't. The problem is we don't realize that they're projections. And the work of Jungian work or Buddhist work is to wake up to realizing that, okay, now we're inside the projection booth, and we're seeing the movie in a very different way. And we're understanding it as fictive in its
Yeah,
essential
and
nature.
in the Buddhist, certainly in the psychological world, we talk about projections a great deal. In the Buddhist world or other religious systems, we talk about attachment.
And
And
we also talk about projection in the Buddhist world as primary, as a basis for attachment.
uh-huh. So, I mean, that's another way we could look at these characters as well, that we're seeing what they're most attached to, including in their images of themselves, oneself. And that's a major way that we try to work through what our projections and attachments are. Do we think we can exist without them?
Which brings us to the question of need, and in a certain sense, in our attachment and their absence, we are facing our own needs in a certain sense, and maybe projecting their fulfillment.
Well, that gets us into a very complicated place, because in a way, if we have a projection on ourselves, we also project what we think we need. So that's something to talk about.
Yeah.
Do you hear an echo? I hear an echo of my voice.
No, I'm okay with your voice.
It
Okay
comes
with
and
mine?
goes, Bev. It comes and goes. So
Comes and goes, yeah.
Michelangelo, yes, right.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome, Michael.
So let me try to, no, it doesn't matter where I sit. Does this matter? Maybe if I sit closer, it doesn't
yeah,
happen.
now there's no echo at all. Now it's
All
good.
right, so it's closeness. Okay. Other comments here?
Professor J. Paul has
Yes, thank you. I think you're having a synchronistic moment in terms of mirroring in the voice. Anyway, what strikes me, and I don't know if you remember me, Beverly, or not, from Zurich. My wife and I, we rented the 2 rooms on the Zurichberg after you and Philip left back in the
My
70s.
goodness. Oh, heaven's sakes. I'm not getting you up on the screen, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I'm there.
Okay.
Okay.
Ah, there you are.
Okay, yeah, little grayer. What strikes me, and I haven't read the book, but it really, the sense of the synchronicity, the time, space, and the timing of all that, I think that is really what is a key element here. But first, what strikes me is, what is the source of the imagery that is going on in terms of persons? Are your source of imagery coming from your dreams or from within? Are they from the dream, or are your images coming from the screen? And it seems nowadays most information people are taking from screens, be it cell phone or like we're doing here today. So what to stop and put in perspective, what is the source? What is the origin of the imagery that is coming into mind, into conscious imagery? And what strikes me too, in terms of how this plays out, in terms of the relationship between conscious mind and the unconscious, of course, is the bridge of the psyche. But I think it's really important to know that there are no electrons, protons, or neutrons in the psyche. I think psyche and soul are totally there's no material basis for it. It's pattern. But anyways, to see soul and psyche from a totally non-materialist perspective, or a spiritual perspective, I think helps give this sense of time and space, and the bending of time now. So anyway, just some comments.
Yeah, and I think you see several different versions in this book of couples in their external life.
Mhm.
And then let's say we can call this their shadow life, the other pair, whether the otherness is the first or the second pair,
Mhm.
where one person in it has a sensibility of something beyond ego, let's say.
Mhm.
beyond the known eye. Maybe
Mhm.
that's a better way to say it.
Mhm.
And the other is totally material.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
in the case of the sociopathic criminal and ultimately killer, that doesn't exist. And so it leads to a strange sense of entitlement. I think that's something we don't talk about very much. The kind of entitlement that comes if all worth is projected into matter
Yes.
or projected into this world terms. Now, in terms of where do our images come from, we'd have to really know what the dreams were of
Mhm.
the people who've been all day on the internet or TikTok or
Yes.
whatever it is, or the Instagram that they're watching. What are their dreams? I
Mhm.
mean, because when it gets down to a personal level, that would be a point. And they don't have to be sleeping dreams. They could be daydreams. They could be coming out of a part of the brain that's got the worst possible name for what it really represents, which is something called the default network system,
Mhm.
which is the part of our brains that's where images are emerging when we're not really thinking of anything. My sense, and also from my reading, what most concerns me is that here we have this book, and this is a man who's been very involved in media. So we're certainly getting many external figures and images, but he's making something of it by how he's connecting them. And what they're finding out in brain research is that those who are growing up in the internet world and social media are not losing anything in terms of cognition. It's in the capacity for reflection.
Mhm.
And the way we hear this, and you could also read all these characters, is how easily are they triggered, which is our language today, which I think is a terrible shame because
Mhm.
it implies we have no agency in how we respond, that the outside world triggers us and it's responsible not to trigger us.
Yeah. Well, you make this very clear by putting it in the terms of context and complexes. I think that putting it in that Jungian context as seeing these different characters as complexes, I think that's very helpful to see that. And you also touched on just earlier there on the sense of otherness. What is going on in terms of the context of otherness, which is an issue that is concerning me now in terms of this whole disclosure movement, which is going on with UAP, of the unidentified anomalous phenomena. It gets into the whole UFO phenomena and what's going on in terms of they're considering it non-human intelligence. And of course, Jung wrote on UFOs, but there's something going on here that might be parallel to this, because there's a whole new sense of otherness, other than human intelligence, that we as humanity on planet Earth maybe we are facing that. I mean, there's just so much the work of John Mack. I mean, there's that's a whole other area, but it has this duplicity, and I'm wondering how that might play out in terms of timing and cultural perspective, and that plus the fact that someone who's central in all that is promoting the brain link, or the implantation of networks into direct brain link, neural link, I think it's called. So I mean, yeah, this is, thank you.
Who are you thinking of?
Elon Musk and
Oh.
Neuralink, they're actually wanting to implant, and they can do that for paraplegics, but they are imagining now with the new Google or the new Apple Vision, the new augmented reality. I mean, it is creating a whole other sense of reality, but the sense of that they're lacking reflection, that's key, because analysis is reflection. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested that you brought up the butterfly. That's just in case we think that Jung is old-fashioned and I'm speaking from my experience here. I'm not insisting that he's the only person on earth who's dealing with the psyche. He's not on earth, but he writes in Memory Streams Reflections, or it's written for him as he dictated it, that when he was a child, he sat on a stone and he said, am I the stone I'm sitting on, or am I the one sitting on the stone? Now, he was what, 8 years old? I don't remember exactly. Maybe someone here does. And how does the most modern of our philosophy books, which is David Chalmers' Reality Plus, is he goes back to the Chinese philosopher with that motif of, am I the butterfly I'm alighting, that's alighting on me, or am I the me that the butterfly is alighting on? So there's the difference there. Let's see, let's say Jung was 10 years old when that happened. That would have been 1885. And Reality Plus came out 2 years ago. And they both start with that kind of motif. So what are we? Are we the object of other people's projections? Are we the object of our needs and desires? Are we the subject of them? In what situations are we the subject? In what situations are we the object? How long does it take to stop being the object of family projections to get to the point of being a subject? See, and I think those kind of motifs, if you apply them to this book, you see there's an incredible richness. There's an incredible richness here. So I don't think I got off track, but
No, but the deep reflection, the deep listening, perhaps the Bohm method of deep reflection and listening and seeing and hearing the images. That's really very, very important, the deep reflection.
Well, I was at the Science of Consciousness conference in Taormina last year. And I don't know if you know about it. It's a combination, it's a convergence of all kinds of scientists. And the pair, are they the Blums, I think? That out of the MIT Media Lab came up with GBT for chat. I mean, we've gone so far into other things now. But they said as a pair that it's laughable it's being called artificial intelligence. It is not intelligence. It's an immense memory gathering machine about collective knowledge, shared collective knowledge, unless someone distorts it. And they said they call what we call artificial intelligence the dumb beast, because it has to keep being fed with new information to be able to move forward. So it doesn't have intelligence. It has knowledge, which can be distorted from our projections and needs or entitlements.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Let's see. One of the things, Beverly, that I noticed, let's see, let me remove a spotlight here, is you mentioned simulation keeps coming up with people from the audience. And the thing that popped into my head too is, and you had mentioned about awaking, do the dreams have to be while you're sleeping? But isn't a reading a book a type of simulation as well?
Look, we're all forms of simulation all the time. You know, again, in my world, we call the psyche a multiplicity within a unity. We call it a process. I hope we're all in some kind of process and can differentiate where value is.
Nice.
And, you know, with all that, that work, for instance, that Jung has done on the alchemical process, which is certainly a form of simulation.
Okay.
You know, anything that we project into that we can change is a form of simulation until it's executed and done.
Hmm.
In that system, they talk about body, soul, and spirit. And the more you go into it, you see that soul is really described as that which we can link to based on our value system, that which we project onto as having worth and value. So it's the feeling link, it's the evaluative link.
Hmm.
And that keeps us, if you want to use that language of simulation, in this ongoing process. Now, the beautiful thing of this model, and I hope this isn't getting too far away, because I do think the creatures in the book, the characters in the book, go through these needs to make these choices and differentiation.
Well, I have a question about that. Where you're going with it right now is, can the two, because there's two versions of most of the characters.
Right.
Can they look at each other as simulations of themselves? Is that
Absolutely. That's the whole
okay?
point.
There we go.
And if we follow Carlo Rovelli's notion, which comes straight out of much of, 20th and 21st century physics, that we create time and space, it doesn't even matter what comes first and what comes second, but we're constantly in these dialogues around what really matters to us.
Well,
And I want to say one thing back to what seems to be an old-fashioned, but is not, that whole alchemical psychological process. They talk about body, spirit, body, soul, and spirit. Body is our experience and our attachments and our projections. Soul is what gets caught in it, and if it really gets caught in it, and we start to project soul onto those things, then soul would die. So in the system that Jung alludes to, soul gets out of the body and goes up in the clouds and has intercourse with spirit.
mhm.
So what is that about? It's about experience, it's about desire, it's about granting value and letting it be dynamic. That's what spirit is. And at any point along the way, we're simulating parts of ourselves. In our religions, our established revealed religions, it was thought you had to separate soul and body for the sake of the body. But in the psychological version of it, you also have to separate them for the sake of the soul. And I'll give you, and there's certain characters in this book. I think we're never going to get to talk about any specific one, but we're talking about many of them. One version of the body using the soul is things like eating disorders, addictions, that sort of thing. If somebody mentioned it in the chat that was being sent out, entanglements, you could certainly use that language in a very analogous, not literal way. So that's what keeps us simulating all the time, because if we're really in process, the old self is the simulation. But if you're identified with the old self, the new self is the simulation.
Right.
And what is staying in process? It's going beyond the fear of losing our old they become predetermined reality of sense of self, letting go of that and moving into what's trying to emerge. So I hope I've said that in a way where people can stay with me on it. Michael, does that answer?
That helps, because for me, thinking about in the pairs and then the simulation, if the people are kind of simulations of each other and kind of like, well, and even in terms of this idea of shadow side that comes up with Jung, where it's like, because you'd mentioned about something that we can link to, but if we can't link to ourselves, even the shadow sides or the parts that we kind of tend to hide and reject, then it's an interesting idea in terms of the dynamics of the characters of the book.
Yeah,
We
now I
have-
do want to say one thing, which is in the popular way shadow is talked about, it's only taken on the valence of that which we undervalue or don't like in ourselves. He also referred to it to that which we overvalue and idealize and can't imagine that we have in ourselves because we're not good enough or smart enough or pretty enough or thin enough or whatever. So that it's what we overvalue and undervalue. So you have to look at what you're idealizing as something you can never be. And that's got a huge emotional valence because that's where things like envy come in. So just remember that when you think about shadow. And he says that's the first step of what we all have to look at in any reflective process.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
We do have a couple more questions, but you wanted to pause for like 5 minutes?
Are we
on the-
already through an hour?
Already almost at the hour, yeah. We started a few minutes late, but we're at the hour and we've got Jun and Michael in the queue. But you
Yeah,
mentioned-
I mean, I don't need to, but I thought it might be give people 5 minutes to reflect a little bit about what they wanted to really
How about we
focus
come back in 5 and we start with Jun and Michael because we've got a kind of a rolling queue. Does that work
Okay.
for it?
Sure.
Jun, if you could step in, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly.
Hi, Michael. You. Beverly.
Rod, you mean me?
Hi there.
No.
Hi. I just wanted to
Whoops.
so much for what you're asking, and also the thing about information as it relates to knowledge, as it relates to wisdom, being sort of what T.S. Eliot's what we've lost in knowledge through information, what we've lost in wisdom knowledge. I have a question for you as it relates to consciousness. And I'm so glad you brought in the science of consciousness in Italy because I'd wanted to go, but been to the science of consciousness in 2016 and 2017 where I presented. And in 2017, the stunning thing Chomsky says that it's related to mysterium or alchemy, which you referred to. And then at the same time, Sir Roger Penrose presents this sort of Schrodinger's dead cat, live cat, and old dead earth, new earth. And what was so compelling is that he said, well, based on gravity, we know that there's something there. And so in terms of simulation, I was curious if there's this both and as far as shadow self. And then when we talk about other self and otherness and other rising, I mean, it's so loaded, but I was curious if there were potentially these metamorphic, like Jungian metamorphic states of consciousness that came through his collective consciousness dreams, where you have the cycle of the egg, and so I should step back. I'm an architect by training, so art history, just got my master's in religious studies. So in terms of transdisciplinary inquiry, I was looking for what is the metamorphic form, energy matter in particular. The form, is there a form that generates an implicate order, Bohm's implicate causal order? So Anne Griswold Ting was my mentor, and she's an architect who took Jung's metamorphic cycle and 1,000 clients that had those subconscious unity consciousness dreams, and took the egg, polarized it into the caterpillar, rotated it into the chrysalis, and then rotated and polarized it again into the butterfly that has fourfold symmetry of the wings that move independently. So when we're talking, I feel like we often will say things from a single lens rather than multiple lenses. of states of multiple states of consciousness that are victim states, willful states, flow states, and then the fourth state, which is as God states. And I think you touched on that. So I'm formulating the question by, in terms of processes of multiplicity, as well as like doppelganger realities, what if it's just that we're capable of apprehending metamorphic states all at once? However, we're conditioned through the educational system of siloing out each thing, each state, each energy state. And what if wholeness gives us this bird's eye view of the labyrinth for both direct experience and this meandering experiences, so that we can recognitize our memories, which we're remembering through the imaginal dream, the imaginal processes in the chrysalis that is sort of I don't know if it's, naming as dream or subconscious or all these things. And also the relevance of that is Einstein's dream, right? And also Descartes' dream. So everything that has ordered our life as we know it, foundationally, Cartesian, Newtonian, Einsteinian, has literally been from historic dreams. And that places all of this into the context, because you've raised the question about context. And then also field conditions of the field condition is not static, but what if my hypothesis has been that it could be what I call circle consciousness, which is spiral, dynamic, biomorphic, bioluminescent, and in particular referencing the luminescent part as it relates to plasma ions, as it relates to non-material energies.
Okay. I think certainly, well, let me take a little step back here. What they're finding out is that there's a very strong connection between anticipation and memory. So that we are already always on a vector. And that to the same degree that we don't let our memories be changed by our current consciousness, we are also shutting down the brain's anticipatory ability. In other words, it's like taking a step off a track when we really think of ourselves as being on a vector. That's not a very good analogy. I don't like what I just said exactly, but I think it's when we get off the track that we're on and we're following a path and we're not too sure where it's going, but we're anticipating it, and all our memories are coming into play at the same time. Now, there's a wonderful neuroscientist called Gerald Edelman. He wrote Bright Air, Brilliant Fire. And he says that consciousness is the remembered present.
Yes.
Now that's everything there. We are remembering. We are at the same time present. So all our past experiences in the present, and at the same time, we are not only experiencing the present, but remembering it. We're registering it. And in that vector, we're already in a mode of anticipation, partly based on past and partly based on our retranscription, which was Freud's term, of the past according to our current consciousness. And that's what memory is. It's not we pull this thing out of the hat and that's what happens. It's today who we are. How do we remember that? And if our memories don't change, we're not changing our consciousness, which means we're out of process. Now, Jung didn't talk about defenses, but one of the great let me say how to say it, prohibitive issues in the growth of consciousness is that there's a certain kind of narcissism that can't even tolerate the otherness coming from ourselves. So that there's an unwillingness to take in material, whether it's someone else reflecting us back to ourselves or our dreams. There's an unwillingness to take it in because it didn't come from the identified I that's mostly based in the ego. So the person won't let in enough information to change that remembered present. And so there's often a sense of needing to control that's very powerful in terms of what one might participate. So that's just one way to think about it. I can't go into all the different layers, but what is luminescence really in terms of our human psyches? It's some light beyond ourselves that we have not attained yet, and which keeps us in the search. That's how I understand it in terms of my field, and I'm sure every field has its own version of that. I hope that helps some.
I do have it's brilliant, thank you. I do have a question related to then when you said patient about precognition, like something in space-time you can know days before it happens. And then, and if you could just say that in relationship of presencing processes. And then I have another question about this otherness, where there's a cultural, societal millennia of self-abandonment, particularly of the feminine divine principle, or a sacred feminine, or anything that is yin to the yang.
Okay, so I organized a conference for the JPA last year on otherness, and we're going to be releasing it soon into the public. So just stay tuned for that. We just did a conference 2 weeks ago on nothingness, which was great.
Okay.
Really came out well. And that'll be released eventually. So who did I just think? What did I just think about? There was something you said that provoked a thought. What was it?
That pre-consciousness and processes.
Oh yeah. I mostly think even Jung sort of misuses that term. And he brought it in terms of his dreams of blood flowing over Europe right before World War I, and he thought it was his precognition of World War I. I think it was his premonition. I'm very involved in emotion research and angles. And premonition is a feeling evaluation. He was listening to patients who were having premonitions about what was going to happen because they were remembering the past and making it into the present. And so they sensed a war might be building. And so I think he had a very strong premonition. I think really that's what we have. And that's based on being physical beings with physical bodies who have to be alert and have good touch with our survival emotions and this instinct and what to do. And I think it's a much more secure way to go than to think about precognition.
Well,
Thank you so much. We do have another person in the queue.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Mike.
it.
Spotlight. Okay, Michael. And we are running close, so if we can keep it to.
Okay, Michael, I'll try and be quick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I was only going to say one thing, but in relation to what was just discussed, I have brought to mind Jung's comment of how he felt when he was writing the answer to Job.
Yeah.
And he apologized. I'm a Swiss. I'm very polite, but I was not here. And he said, this is what happens when the spirit of the depths sees you by the scruff of the neck. And I think we get these soul intrusions, which are very uncomfortable at times for certain people, and probably for all of us. So I just want to say that. The other thing I wanted to say was about simulation. Look, there's a very fundamental philosophical question one has to ask here at the beginning, namely, a simulation of what? Simulation means to simulate something. What is it that we're simulating? And I think we may change the metaphor, but we still are left with the same philosophical question, namely, what is real? And the simulation does not solve that question.
Okay, well, just again, in psychological terms, we are always in a field with otherness. And certainly Ravelli's Helgoland, which I've quoted several times, talks about the relational physics, and certainly the implicate order and the work of David Pete is relational fields between all the different factors in matter and in mind. For that's really what it is in many ways. And so I can be one person with one patient and one person with the other patient. With one patient, I am the smartest person I've ever heard. And I'm so intelligent and so insightful. I'm so proud of myself. And in the next patient, I'm the dumbest person that I've ever known. And it's so much to do with the fields that we are in. And
Yes.
we know that we are deeply affected by those mutual projection transferred fields. So I think the simulation, almost every case, can be who we are in that field, but it's also who we want to be in that field. We want to be different people in different settings, and
Yeah,
not to get
I think
identified
that
with
makes sense.
any one of them as psyche. Now, Jung thought that Answer to Job was going to be much more provocative and conflictual than his theory of synchronicity, because he knew it was a huge psychic projection and encounter that he was involved with there. And somebody mentioned synchronicity. I just want to say one thing about it. When we notice a connection between something we thought and something that's happened outside, whether it's a premonition or not, but when we notice it, that's a synchronous event. It's only when we do self-reflection to find out why we were at that point that we had that connection, and we grant it meaning that provokes us to more self-exploration that is synchronistic. Unless one does that psychic work, it's synchronous and not synchronicity. So I think we have to be very clear about that.
I certainly agree, and with everything you said. But there's one more thing in relation to simulations. You know, I think there's a valid technological use that we can use simulation to enhance our self-awareness, and that is through VR. VR is a simulation of what the brain does in terms of generating reality. And the fact that we can look at childhood, where it takes us about 16 months to really settle into this world in a certain sense. That's, in Schrodinger's sense, that's collapse of the wave function into a person's personal experience. What we're talking about here is reopening that. And in a sense, maybe redoing it more consciously. And you can call that rebirth, or whatever you want. But but I think a key to that would be using VR to do that, to show us that we can do many simulations in a certain sense, which are vividly real, and so on, to reopen our awareness to that which was closed maybe at 16 months or something like that. That's just a
I
thought.
think though, Michael, we all have our own fields where that happens. For some people, it may be VR. For some people, it may be their dreams, you know, that they can take as a simulation of self to get to know. For some people, it's their creative process, their making of art and imagery and music. I don't think we can project it strictly into VR because we all have different versions of virtual worlds.
I agree. The only point I'm making is that I think generally the simulation theory is kind of useless if it's hung out there on its own. But if I think we want to make a use of it, this, using VR could be one of the ways of doing that. I'm not excluding anything, and I'm acknowledging what you say about that. But it just, rather than hang it out there in some metaphysical netherland, it could be useful if we begin to understand it in terms of VR, and it could bear upon how we experience in a fundamental way reality.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
We
Michael.
really didn't talk about this book, but we did. We were talking about the book without talking about specific characters. But I hope if you decide to go back and read the book again or read it for the first time, that this conversation has helped you with it. We'll help you with it. We'll make it a richer experience. And if you don't mind, I'd like to mention a few other books that I'm very fond of. One is
Definitely.
called The Rigor of Angels by Eggleston, and it's about Kant, Borges, and Heisenberg. Another one is Benjamin Laboute's book. He's a Chilean author. When we cease to understand the world, and it's about the mad side of 20th century scientists. So read it as part fiction, but a kind of focusing on the mad side. And then his second book is Maniac, which was the acronym for the first computer that John von Neumann created. And it's like a biography of John von Neumann, but again, especially emphasizing the mad side of his process. So Rigor of Angels by Eggleston, I've mentioned Helgoland, When We Cease to Understand the World, and Maniac. So just for your own reading pleasure. Eleanor, thank you for inviting me. Maureen, hello, Maureen. I hope you're there.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you for being here today and for taking the time and thank you everybody for coming today. Thank you.
Yes,
It's been an
thank
honor,
you.
Beverly. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, thank you so much, Beverly, and thank you everyone for participating today. And we have a few small announcements to make before we leave. We do have in-person events coming up in June, and there are some spaces. So if you go on the Pari Center website, paricenter.com, and click on events, you can actually come to Italy and enjoy meeting people in person as well. Our next online event will be The Future Mind, a conversation with Federico Fagan. And that will be part of our Future Mind series, which is continuing on a monthly basis. And Eleanor, is there anything else?
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Beverly. And thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you at the Pari Center. Bye-bye.